There was too much good stuff that I took away from studying Jay Wright in his book, Attitude, Developing a Winning Mindset on and Off the Court, that I wanted to do a bonus episode on him. I'll probably do this with some frequency on coaches as, one, I have a tendency for thoroughness and love way too many stories from these guys, not to shed light on more of them, and two, they make the episodes more approachable time-wise. For the first episode, the core episode, I'll likely keep that one closer to the key learnings of the coach and the coaching takeaways from him or her. And for the bonus episode, that one may lean toward the extra stuff that might be more of deep track knowledge from a certain part of their life or career, or just have some entertainment value. That's the thought right now anyway. So welcome to the bonus episode on Jay Wright, which is just that, a deeper dive into his earlier career, some fun stories from that and other chapters of his life, and an extra story about the Team Chaplain role at Villanova, which I think you'll find really interesting. In this episode, I think you'll love hearing about his time as a footloose and fancy-free college grad working in Philadelphia for the Philadelphia Stars of the USFL, more about how he ended up becoming a Villanova assistant in the late 80s. That was equal parts luck, creativity, and his hallmark, and above-average attitude. And as I alluded to, much more about the somewhat mind-blowing, in a good way, prominence of the Team Chaplain role at Villanova, and the awesome characters involved with that, Father Bernard Lazor and Father Rob Hagan. So without further ado, let's jump in and peel back some extra layers on Coach Jay Wright. This is the Coaches Podcast. For starters, let's take it back to the spring of 1983 and talk about Jay's USFL experience. This is when a young Jay Wright had just finished his playing days at Bucknell in central Pennsylvania. Of his playing days there at Bucknell, he said, "I thought I was a lot better player than I was." And he shares that he got an offer to play with a low-level team in France, but that was about it. So Jay was a solid D1 player. He had a great junior season as a 6'3" point guard. He was the MVP of that team. But as can be the fickle nature of sports and the game of inches that it is at this level, he got hurt his senior year and actually ended up losing his starting spot to Jay Andrews, who went on to become one of Bucknell's all-time leading scorers. Jay was still co-captain of that team and a leader, and in hindsight, a total resume for a good coach. Solid player, co-captain of the team, great intangibles, but not the superstar type, and at the end, not even the starter, due to some sort of rough luck of an all-timer in Jay Andrews being just ahead of him. So after Jay graduates, he says, "I was way too much of a Philly homebody to take the job in France." So he takes this USFL job in the summer of 1983. This was the summer after the USFL's inaugural season, so this was peak USFL. The USFL had a very brief history. It only lasted until 1985, but Jay was there when the hype was probably at its highest. The USFL was supposed to be this spring-summer alternative to the NFL, but again, it ultimately never took root and folded in 1985. But in the meantime, Jay has this incredible experience for a year. He says in the book, "I couldn't have fallen into a better situation. As a recent college graduate, I was part of a marketing team whose job was to sell tickets and promote our players to boost attendance at the Stars games in Veterans Stadium, the 65,000-seat venue where the Eagles played too. It was a small staff office, so a small group of people, and so they all wore a lot of hats, which results in Jay getting pulled into all these really fun experiences, especially for a recent college graduate." I have to share this, and this wasn't in the book, but I ran into it in some other research I was doing on Jay Wright. And that was this article from Philadelphia Magazine sharing how during this time when Jay was in this USFL job, he once had to even fill in for Bart the Star, the Philly Star mascot, when the mascot didn't show up to a promotion event. So it's kind of fun to think of Jay Wright sweating it out in some Philly bar, dressed up as Bart the Star, silently pantomiming as the mascot to sell some Philly Stars tickets. But perhaps aside from that one, most of his extracurriculars were really cool and fun for Jay. One that stands out was when he was tapped by owner Carl Peterson, who went on to become the president of the Kansas City Chiefs, interestingly enough. And he tapped Jay to go to the Meadowlands in New York to attend what was a very big press conference at the time. And that was when the New Jersey Generals, they were New Jersey's USFL team, were announcing that they were acquiring Heisman Trophy winner Herschel Walker right out of college, snatching him from even the NFL. I didn't totally remember this. Of course, I was 2 years old at that time, but I didn't fully realize that the great Herschel Walker went to the USFL first, right from his mythical career at Georgia. And the reason he did was they backed up the truck and paid him. They made him the highest paid professional football player in the world at the time. It was a 3-year, $5 million contract, which sounds like a backup punter's contract today, but it was top of the heap then. And guess who was behind it all? Yes, that's right, Donald Trump, then New Jersey Generals owner Donald Trump. The famous broadcaster Howard Cosell was at that press conference as well. So super cool experience for Jay to be a part of what I imagine was a relatively small room of people at that press conference. The other great thing for Jay, the best thing I guess I should say, out of this whole USFL experience was that he met his wife there, Patricia Riley, and she goes on to be an incredible partner for him throughout his life, and it seems like they have a great marriage. They're still married today. They have a beautiful family, 2 boys and a girl. Jay shares how she's sports crazed just like he is, and during his coaching days, she would watch game film with him. But quickly on how he met her, because it's a good story, one of his Philly Stars' duties at this time was that he would have these weekly outings to go to Philadelphia bars and restaurants to promote the team and sell tickets. And on the Philly Stars side, it was always one player, one coach, a cheerleader, and then Jay in attendance at these things. You guessed it, one of those fateful nights, he says, the beautiful cheerleader/marketing rep was Patty Riley, who later became my wife. And more crazy signals and serendipity here for Jay's future that are aligning here as well. Patty is a recent graduate of, you guessed it, Villanova. She was actually a cheerleader there as well. She was on the sidelines during Villanova's Elite Eight run that just happened in 1983. Being a part of Villanova as a coach or anything else wasn't even a glimmer in Jay's eye at this point. But he was a huge Villanova fan since childhood, as we learned in the other episode. And so, upon learning she was a Villanova graduate and cheerleader, Jay probably took a knee right then and there. And like I said, Patty Riley loves sports herself. In the book, he says, my sports-loving wife truly does enjoy watching the game tape with me. We play a lot of golf and tennis together as well. This USFL experience for Jay is his first experience in the sports world, I guess you could say. It was a marketing role. He said at this time, I was in my marketing man mode and living a dream. It's also interesting to note that at present day here in 2026, after a stint as a broadcaster and analyst for CBS, and after Jay's Villanova coaching days, Jay is now special assistant to the president at Villanova, where, amongst other things, he assists the president on the university's mission, it says online. I would imagine that entails things like fundraising and involvement in the community. So maybe a little bit of a full circle moment here for Jay. My instincts tell me he's probably putting on that marketing man hat again, except instead of pitching the Philadelphia Stars, he's pitching Villanova University. So at this time in young Jay's life, he has zero plans to get into coaching. He's in this pretty glamorous spot for a 22-year-old. However, as he says, fate was about to step in. And I cover this in the core episode on Jay, but just a little more detail here. He had this buddy that he played at Bucknell with who was a mentor to him in the year that they played together, and this guy was coaching at D1 Drexel, but he wasn't making much money. Jay Wright said his salary was paltry even by 1984 standards. That buddy was Pat Flannery, and Flannery had just gotten married and was starting a family, so he was looking at other jobs, hoping to move up the pay scale. And he looks at University of Rochester, even though it's Division III, it actually paid more than his Drexel assistant job at the time. And this guy just needs some diaper money and things of that nature as he's starting a family. So Flannery gives Rochester a hard look, but ultimately decides that he can't make the move from Division I to Division III, even though it's a little bit more money. And he feels really bad about going down that path with Rochester, and so he gives him Jay's name, seemingly out of nowhere. And maybe this was for Flannery to soften the blow of rejecting the job, or maybe it was because he had just spoken to Jay on the phone, or maybe he saw some potential in Jay as a coach. It doesn't really give that level of detail in the book, but nonetheless, one thing is clear, Jay wasn't looking to get into coaching himself. It was not his ambition at this point. But Jay does his buddy a solid, and he goes and talks to Rochester. In his own words, he says, I was hesitant, and I loved what I was doing with the Stars. The thought of a Division III coaching job in upstate New York, well, he says, it didn't sound that enticing, but I had decided to at least listen to what Mike Neer, the Rochester head coach at the time, had to say. I had zero coaching experience. I also wasn't sure I wanted the job. That's not the best way to walk into an interview, Jay says. However, if I may borrow from Paul Harvey, now you know the rest of the story. Jay goes in, he interviews, he ends up taking the job. And what I love is that he captures some really beautiful things as it relates to a person finding their calling, which I share fully in the previous episode on Jay, but the shorter version of it here is, after only 3 days in Rochester, I knew that this was my heaven on earth. I couldn't wait to get up and get into work. And when my day was supposed to be over, I didn't want to leave. And just like that, by taking a chance on a job I didn't think I was qualified for and wasn't sure I wanted, I had found what I was most passionate about. And there's another story I love from this chapter of Jay's life that shows his character. It's also another fun story that highlights Jay's pure passion for the culture of basketball. The first year he's at Rochester, he gets the opportunity to go to the National Association of Basketball Coaches, the NABC convention, which was always held in conjunction with the Final Four. And he goes there and he says, it just blew my mind. It was inconceivable to me that you could walk around a corner and be a few feet from Bob Knight, Dean Smith, or Denny Crum. So I'm telling you, it almost seems like Jay's identity as a fan of college basketball almost outweighs his identity as a coach or member of college basketball. Almost. I love that about him. And more serendipity on that NABC trip, that Final Four trip. When he goes there, it also happens to be 1985. And that's the year 3 out of the 4 teams are Big East teams, including Villanova, who is an 8 seed under Coach Rolly Massimino that is on this Cinderella run. And on top of that, Jay's new girlfriend and future wife, as a Villanova alumnus, was going to the Final Four with her family as well, so he'd get to see her down there. So young Jay is just riding a wave here. But to me, as we'll find is the pattern in Jay's life, it's a wave that comes about because, in my opinion, of the great energy and attitude this guy has. And also, as we're about to find out, how he has character and does things the right way. the combination of those two things is highly likely to take you to some great places. The moment of character I'm referencing there is while he's on this epic trip and going to that convention and gets to see his beloved Villanova in the semifinal game and gets to hang out with his new girlfriend, he has sort of a moral conflict. He could stay and watch Villanova play in the final Monday night with his girlfriend and among all the other high-profile folks who were at the Final Four, but then reality hits him. As part of his assistant coaching duties at Rochester, he also moonlights as the assistant intramural director, and he's supposed to be back in Rochester to run a floor hockey tournament that Monday. And so he has to make a choice, but it wasn't really a choice for him. Even though it pained him to leave, he fulfills his duties, he gets on a flight back to Rochester, leaves all that Final Four glitz and glamour, and goes and runs what one can assume is a slightly less glamorous floor hockey tournament back in Rochester. For the Final Four championship game that Monday night, he said he rushed from the floor hockey tournament and went to the house of Terry Gurnett, who was Rochester's women's soccer coach, and he watched as much of the game as he could with Coach Gurnett and his wife, and he said, "I was the only one with tears in my eyes when it was over." This reminds me of when I was at a work training in Spokane, when it happened to be the Cubs' Game 7 of the 2016 World Series. I'm a lifelong Cubs fan. I've been wearing their hats and rooting for them since birth, and I was at my brother's house with he and his wife during this game, and they pull off that miracle victory after the rain delay in Game 7, and I'm sitting there hiding my tears, talking to my wife on the phone. It was a bit of an uncomfortable experience, so I can relate to Jay right there. But what Jay did in that whole story is a character moment for him. He goes and runs an intramural floor hockey tournament when it wasn't easy to do, especially against such a glamorous alternative. But he just does the next right thing, so to speak. And that's a pattern you'll see with Jay, including another small moment that summer when it's basketball camp season. And as a lowly assistant, he's still at Rochester. You're trying to line up as many of these camps as you can, which is the stock and trade of a college assistant to try to make some extra money in the summer. And of course, he's dying to be one of the coaches selected for the 2-week Villanova camp. That's far and away number one on his list that summer, but he says, with the Wildcats being only 2 months removed from a national championship, that camp was huge. It was so big, and Coach Mass had such a machine that my application to serve as an instructor was denied. I was feeling pretty dejected, he says. I was young and wanted everything to happen instantaneously. But once again, he shows character. He gets over it, and he just gets back to doing what he's supposed to do. Does his job, as Bill Belichick would say. And he hits the road recruiting for Rochester, and he's at Comstock High School on Long Island, I believe is how you say that. And he's chatting with their coach, Frank Romeo. Romeo happened to be a good friend of Coach Massimino, and Romeo brought his team to the Villanova camp every summer. And in that conversation, Romeo asked Jay if he'd be working there. And Jay said, "No, I tried. They were fully staffed. I won't be there, unfortunately," type of thing. But then Romeo, probably recognizing Jay's, again, great energy and attitude, then suggests that Jay should join his staff for the week. That would allow Jay to get into the camp through the back door, so to speak. So Jay says, basically, I was a tag-along guy who somebody at Villanova had to wedge into the lineup of camp coaches. Another way to put it, I snuck into my first ever coaching assignment at Villanova. Good things happen to good people could be an alternate title for this book and Jay Wright's life. You get what you deserve, so to speak. And for Jay, he deserves these things because that's what he puts out there in the world. Good energy and character. Don't underestimate how far those can take you. So he goes on to work this camp, and of course has a great attitude. He's happy to be a gopher and do whatever the Villanova staff needs. And he even gets noticed by Coach Massimino. He gets a compliment from him that sends Jay to the moon. It says in the book, at the end of one particular night, Coach Mass approached me and said, "You're going to be a good coach." Jay Wright says, "Wow, there aren't words to describe how proud I was in that moment. To me, Coach Mass was the greatest coach on the planet. From everything I'd read about him and everything I'd picked up on listening to the players and assistants who worked with him, Coach Raleigh Massimino represented everything I wanted to be. A family man, a leader who cared about his team beyond just basketball, and yes, a national champion. In that instant, my goals were set," Jay says. But again, let's not just chalk this up to luck. Jay Wright makes these things happen for himself because he does the next right thing. He proves he can be a good teammate before he officially is. In Jay's words, he says, "I wanted to be a part of the Villanova team, and by volunteering, helping out, and having fun with the assistants and coaching staff, I was proving that I could be a team player." So there you go, in his own words. Show it, be about it before it actually happens. Demonstrate your worth by proving it, that you'll be a great team member, and very often, that will become your reality. Performing with a great attitude like he did in that Villanova camp in the late 80s, that plants the seeds that will just 2 years later get him an offer to be on the Villanova staff under Coach Massimino. First, he goes to Drexel one year. It's a Philadelphia school that, being the Philadelphia homebody he is, gets him back in the Philadelphia area. But then, lo and behold, just 1 year into that job, an assistant job opens up on the Nova staff, and Steve Lapis, a then Villanova assistant that Jay Wright had bonded with at that camp and really helped out at that camp, helps get Jay that job. So from door shut in his face with a rejection letter on the Villanova camp to being a Villanova assistant just 2 years later. Jay shows resilience, a self-fulfilling positive attitude, two of the hallmarks that certainly made a lot of magic happen for this man in his life and career. Jay doesn't share a ton about his years as a Villanova assistant, but he's there from 87 through 92. It's a dream job for him as a kid growing up loving Villanova basketball, and now he's a part of Coach Massimino's staff, and one can imagine loving most every minute. But then unexpectedly, in 1992, Coach Massimino takes a job at UNLV, a place that is the antithesis to the Villanova culture at the time. But this is a really interesting chapter, and I believe what UNLV was going for was a reinvention, a reimage of their program, if you will, after the Jerry Tarkanian era, the Tark the Shark era. Steve Wynn, billionaire owner of Wynn Resorts, had his hands in this as well, Jay mentions in the book. Apparently some of the motivation in hiring Coach Massimino was that Wynn wanted to turn Las Vegas into a family town, and so Coach Massimino, with his values, was part of that bridge, part of that plan to help migrate Vegas into a family town. It's a very Vegas story, showing how that town worked, how it probably still works. And so Coach Massimino takes that job, and he asks Jay Wright to go with him. And Jay Wright, barely thinking about it, probably because Massimino's his idol and his leader, he says, yeah, I'll go. But it all ends up being this really weird chapter. Massimino himself is actually ushered out after a couple of years because of this side pay contract / scandal that comes up. And in addition to that, the whole UNLV basketball scene and the staff remaining there had what Jay Wright calls the most unique form of loyalty to a coach he's ever seen. Again, that former coach being Jerry Tarkanian, who was essentially forced out prior to Massimino due to a lot of things, but there were pictures of his players with a sports fixer. There was a lot of potential recruiting violations and other extracurriculars. UNLV was scary good under Tark the Shark in those days. They had Larry Johnson and Stacey Ogman, but there was always a lot of smoke around that program, if you will. Jay Wright says of this period, and for Coach Massimino, in the end, taking the UNLV job after Jerry Tarkanian was a no-win proposition for anyone who followed him. And again, he says it was one of the most unique senses of loyalty to a former coach that he's ever seen. But even before Coach Mass gets ushered out of UNLV, Jay Wright and Patty decide that Las Vegas isn't for them. They want to get back to the Northeast. And so Jay's looking at jobs, and he applies to Hofstra, who had a head coach opening. But once again, he gets the door slammed in his face here, just as he did with the Villanova basketball camp. He says, I received a perfunctory letter that thanked me for applying, but informed me that I would not be a candidate. So he doesn't even make it into the interview round. And it says he mentioned that letter and his disappointment to Coach Massimino. And in another moment of it's not what you know, but who you know, just as with Frank Romero getting him into the Villanova camp, Coach Massimino picks up the phone. It so happens that the Hofstra AD is Jim Garvey, who was a former Big East referee that Massimino knows. And he tells him, just do yourself a favor and interview this kid. I guarantee that you won't be sorry. Jay says, from my vantage point, it seemed clear that Jim, the Hofstra AD, had already completed his interviews and settled on another candidate. But like the great recruiter he is, Coach Mass kept hammering his point home to Jim. Finally, Jim relented and agreed to meet me in Charlotte during the annual coaches convention. There's that NABC coming in again. Jay says, Jim and I instantly hit it off, and shortly after my flight home from the conference landed in Las Vegas, my phone rang. It was Jim calling me to offer me the job. Again, people want to help guys like Jay, and Coach Massimino certainly did that, but he also earns it. He impresses Jim Garvey, the Hofstra AD, so much that the guy's calling him before he even gets home from that trip, offering him that job. And so he takes that Hofstra job, and he's there from 94 to 2001. He ultimately proves himself there as a capable head coach, taking that team to the NCAA tourney in his 6th and 7th years, which as a mid-major is a huge deal. As Dan Hurley shared in his book as well, and Coach Wright says something similar in here, he says those mid-major championship games to get in the NCAA tournament, those are as much stress as you'll ever experience as a coach, because that's your only hope. You're not going to get an at-large bid. It's win the conference championship, win the conference tournament, or nothing else. And both those guys share what high stress those situations are. Hurley said it was even more stressful than his 2 NCAA championship games, I believe. One other thing I want to highlight from this Hofstra chapter is the excellent job of patience and allowing compounding to happen that Jay and the administrative leadership at Hofstra do to get that program into a winning place. Hofstra was a perennial loser before Jay got there, so much so that Jay shares that Eastern Basketball Magazine, a well-respected industry source at the time, listed all of the New York area Division I schools, and Hofstra wasn't even included. They simply left it out. That's how far off the grid we were, Jay says. So basketball is sputtering there. Doesn't really have too many signs of life. But Jay says it did have some other things going for it. He says, we arrived at Hofstra at a wonderful moment. It was a dynamic university and was ready to take off in the mid-90s. The president, Dr. James Sheward, was a former football player at the school and a great guy. Stuart Rabinowitz directed the law school then and today is Hofstra's president. These were energetic leaders interested in growing the university. So again, a lot of credit to these guys because Jay's first 4 seasons were all losing seasons. I'm talking 10 wins, 9 wins, 11 wins, against 16 or 18 losses each year those first 4 years. So not great years on paper. But it's a classic J-curve example because what's not being seen in that win-loss record is all the compounding and all the tapping of the rock, as we talked about in the core episode on Jay. Those small, sometimes imperceptible moments and gains that are happening in this program that finally kick in and shoot that J-curve up like a hockey stick in his final 3 years, where he wins 22, 24, and 26 games respectively, including 2 America East titles his last 2 years, which get them into the big dance. Jay says, bringing home 2 America East titles was one of the greatest thrills of my life. It had taken so long to get there, and it meant the world to everyone at Hofstra to be on that kind of stage. Good things take time, and that's a prime example of that. And yes, it's probably a lot easier to endure that process when you're a program that is already in the cellar like Hofstra was. But credit to all the leadership involved in that, and credit to Jay for sticking with that, and it's awesome how it pays off. And so because of his last 2 years at Hofstra, he's labeled a hot coach, which he says struck me as ironic since only a few years earlier, people speculated our staff might not survive Hofstra. But that's the life of a college coach, he says. So he's getting some offers, and it's looking like he's going to go to Rutgers. Their AD, Bob Mulcahy, had Jay and his wife, Patty, pretty far down that path. And Wright says, it seemed like a natural fit for me. It was less than an hour's drive from Bucks County. It was in the Big East, and Mulcahy had a great vision for the program. But then on a Friday afternoon, as he's looking really hard at this Rutgers job and pretty far down that path, it's announced that Steve Lapis is leaving Villanova. He ends up going to UMass, and so twist of fate and a fast one, Jay Wright says, before I knew it, I was seated in a New Jersey restaurant with Villanova's athletic director, Vince Nicastro. By Tuesday afternoon, March 27, 2001, we were in the pavilion for a press conference introducing me as the head coach. Jay shares his joy over this, saying, to call this my dream job was an understatement. I felt as if I had come home. We've talked a lot about how Jay has earned his own luck so far, but this one is probably just good old-fashioned luck. Or one could argue the hand of God was in it. Because no matter how big of a fan you were as a kid, or a fan you are of a school or a program, there just has to be good timing there for you to get that head coaching job, a vacancy, etc. Even Jay Wright says in hindsight, the dream of returning to Villanova never evaporated. When he was at Hofstra, he continued to follow the Wildcats closely. But he says, I didn't spend a lot of time thinking about coaching at Villanova anytime soon. I would always be a fan of the Cats, but professionally, it felt like my future would take me elsewhere. That's not unusual in college athletics. You go where the opportunities are. It's rare when the stars align to give you the chance to go home. He reinforces the point that the hand of God may have been involved. He says, I also realized that much of my career track and life were attributable to faith. God's got a plan, and I came to believe that it's my job to give my best effort. That's it. Wherever God decides my life should go, I'll deal with it. And then he adds, and this is a fitting into this section, he says, staying true to that attitude can sometimes lead you to exactly where you want to go. Okay, as promised, let's talk about the team chaplain role at Villanova. This was really fun to read about how Villanova uses these guys. They have a super prominent and involved role, almost as high up the ladder as a lead assistant type of role. For those of you not in the know, Villanova is a Catholic university in the Augustinian tradition, and so like other Catholic universities, they often appoint a team chaplain to be a spiritual and faith guide in line with their university's mission and beliefs. Those roles can vary, it's safe to say. Some just may pop in to offer a quick prayer, others like Villanova or at my alma mater, Gonzaga, with Father Tony Lehman, when he was there for 20 years, can be really involved. Villanova's team chaplains may be the most involved of all, however, and under Jay's tenure there, they had 2 great ones, Father Bernard Lazor and Father Rob Hagen. They're a really awesome story. Let's start with Father Lazor, who was Jay's first one. He was a long-standing team chaplain and was there under Coach Massimino in that era when Jay was an assistant there in the 80s and 90s. And he was still there when Jay came back to be the head coach in 2003. In that Massimino era, they had huge success. As I mentioned earlier, they had that Cinderella run as an 8 seed to win it all in 1985 and other deep runs in the tournament. And Jay joins the staff as an assistant. Shortly after that, he joins in 1987. It's peak 80s Villanova basketball, if you will. And Jay's coming from Division III Rochester and a quick stop at Drexel, so he has a little bit of other coaching experience and other experience at universities, but he's blown away by the role of this team chaplain at Villanova. He says, Coach Mass viewed his basketball program as a family. His approach fit perfectly into the culture of Villanova, but he was hardly the only father figure in the Wildcat family in those days. There was one remarkable person who embodied the bond between the university and our program, our team chaplain, Father Bernard Lazor, OSA. So here you've got this living legend, Coach Massimino, pretty well fresh off of winning it all in 1985, but Jay's fresh eyes coming in as an assistant are seeing Father Lazor as the guy who perhaps embodies the Villanova way the best. Jay continues with how unique this role was. He says, it was amazing and yes, surprising to see such qualities in a priest. He was competitive too, and had been a great baseball player in his day. I was astonished to see what a strong role the team chaplain played in Coach Mass's program. He was at the games, he was with us on the road, He was there for everything and everyone. He seemed to hold both a leadership position and a support position, and that was remarkable to me, Jay says. Jay continues with some extra color here. He says, this wasn't someone who came in, gave a perfunctory prayer to get it out of the way, and then went about his day. The coaching staff and players all looked to him as one of their own and sought guidance from him, sometimes on a very personal level. He also said how Father Lazor would give care to the assistant coaches and tough love to them, saying, hey, it's a privilege to be here, so suck it up type of thing. And he would also get on the refs over bad calls. So that's the kind of role these team chaplains have at Villanova. It's super prominent, way more than you would think. And so when Jay comes back in the early 2000s, as I mentioned earlier, Father Lazor is still there, but it was only for his first couple of years. Father Lazor's health began to fail, but much like the Green Bay Packers with their quarterback position or some of these other organizations who seem to know how to replace great with great, Father Rob Hagan takes over, and Father Rob is there for the rest of Jay's time at Villanova, and Father Rob knocks it out of the park. He takes over the team chaplain role in 2004, and it's interesting to note that Father Rob had just become a priest in 2003. He was actually a Villanova graduate, the class of 1987. That's the same year Jay joined Villanova as an assistant, ironically enough. But Father Rob then went on to law school and practiced law in the Philadelphia area successfully until he felt this calling to become a priest. And I don't know how he landed this rookie priest gig as the team chaplain on the Villanova basketball team, but that's what he walks right into, and he was obviously very well equipped for it. Jay Wright said of him, he's an integral, indispensable, and undeniable part of any success we have as a team. Father Rob is all over the book. It seems like there's a Father Rob story for every meaningful moment or chapter in this book. I'll just highlight some of the big ones here. As I mentioned in the other podcast, when they got knocked out of the second round as a number 1 seed by number 8 seed NC State in 2015, this was a year before they would go on to win it all, but they had this huge upset. And this hurts, and they know it's going to hurt, and they know they're going to be questioned about it constantly, and it's going to be a lot of adversity that they'll have to navigate for at least the next year until they get a chance to prove themselves again in the tournament the following year. And it's Father Rob who, through that adversity, sets the perspective for the team and the program on how to handle this. He's the one that says the key things, or at least this is how Jay Wright shares this, that set the team up and get them in the right place mentally, spiritually to handle this. It's a really key moment that starts this chain of events that ultimately end up with them working through it and winning the national championship the following year. But at this time, when they're wrestling with this agony of getting knocked out early, Father Rob tells the program some things that set the stage for how they'll handle this. He says, if all we did was come to Villanova to win a national championship, then I guess you would consider the 2014-2015 season a failure. However, if we remember that we came to this university to grow in mind and spirit, to build relationships and lifelong lasting friendships, we will see the larger picture. And Jay says in the book, at this moment, it struck me just how deeply that message had seeped into our players' hearts over the course of that season and their years at Villanova. So Father Rob clearly knew how to land a message in the hearts and minds of the players and the staff, and his words were something the whole program drew upon as they navigated that whole year, to see that bigger picture, to see themselves as brothers, and that this wasn't the end, that there was more to it than that, and that they weren't going to be defined by just losing one basketball game. Father Rob has more to say in those post-game remarks. He continued, when we give more than we receive, we may not win every game, but we'll see a sunrise after every sunset, and always see a light through the darkness. Jay Wright says it was perfect. Jay Wright knew they were going to have to deal with their performance and would likely have to answer questions about that game all the way into next year, as I mentioned. They still had a lot of road to hoe on that end of things, but quoting Jay here, he said, Father Rob's message offered them the freedom to understand that there's so much more to their lives than the games they play. Perhaps most importantly, Jay says, we walked out of the hotel that morning feeling like, hey, this is not fun, but we can handle it. We're going to be all right. And then another one of Father Rob's big moments that I want to share here was when they opened that season, that 2015-16 season. And it's their first game in November against the Fairleigh Dickinson Knights. And Jay Wright says Father Rob set the tone for the entire season when he compared one of the things that Jay Wright harps on coaching-wise, which is for the team to get in their defensive stance so that they have good posture and their legs underneath them. And that allows them to set the tone for all the other moves they'll make on the court and sets them up for success, so to speak. And Father Rob compared the value in that posture to being the same reason that they pray before each game. They always said the Lord's Prayer from Matthew chapter 6, aka the Our Father, before each game, and that was one of the reasons they did that, to get in that posture. And I'll just throw this in here quickly because Jay Wright throws it in a few times in the book. He's a Catholic, he's a Christian, but he makes the point to say at several spots in this book that their prayers and Father Rob's remarks, quoting Jay, are based in Christianity in the Bible, but every single person in our basketball family, be they Jewish or Muslim or atheist, know just how universal his reflections truly are. He goes on to say the values are so essential to the brotherhood we'd built. So the point being, Jay's Christian, he's at a Christian university, and he's not ashamed of the gospel, certainly, but he's also very sensitive and very respectful to his other players' beliefs Another Father Rob moment in this book that I really love was before a January game that season against what Jay Wright said was a red-hot Providence team. Jay Wright shares how Father Rob told this parable, and somewhat to the point I just made, this isn't a biblical parable, but it has an awesome message. Some of you may know this one. It's about a grandfather teaching his grandson about human nature and how with every human heart there are two wolves, and that they're fighting it out every day. And the grandfather tells the grandson, one wolf says, make sure you get yours. Take the shortcut, the pain-free route, and get as much pleasure out of life as you can. But the other wolf is in there fighting, saying, do the right thing, even if it costs you time or money. Make the sacrifices for someone else. It might be more difficult, but life can be more meaningful and fulfilling. Do what might be unpopular, knowing it will make a positive difference in the long run. And then the grandson sits with this and thinks for a second and asks his grandpa, well, which one wins? And the grandfather wisely replies, the one that we feed. After telling that parable to the team, Father Rob added, so much of our lives and decisions are affected by our value system, what we are feeding our minds and hearts. I thought that was a really cool moment, a great message about how what we focus on becomes our reality and our value system. And then one last one on Father Rob. This one made me somewhat uncomfortable reading it, as it did for Jay Wright and all those involved in it, it sounds like. But it worked out in a really cool way. This was before Villanova's Sweet 16 game in Louisville in that 2016 season, and it happened to be Holy Thursday in the Christian church, which is the day of the Last Supper that Jesus had with his disciples before he was crucified. It's called Maundy Thursday. It was when, in Father Rob's words, Jesus had his own team meal. And Father Rob had some really beautiful words for the team here about that, about being a team and serving one another and playing for the person next to you. He said Jesus had gathered with all those closest to him to share a very important and everlasting meal. He shared it with those who had gone through so much with him. He could have given them a beautiful speech on the value of love and sacrifice, but rather than say, do as I say, Jesus said, do as I do. He took this last meal with them as an opportunity to solidify what it means to truly live for others, and he washed their feet in an act of humble service. By doing that, he gave us a piece of himself for all time. And in this hotel meeting room in Louisville, when Father Rob makes these remarks, no one other than Father Rob knew what was coming next. So they were all a bit taken back with what Father Rob did next. He starts with Jay and actually grabs a pitcher of iced tea. He meant to grab a pitcher of water, and he washes Jay's feet with it, with the iced tea no less. Jay says that no one noticed the iced tea part other than he and Father Rob, but then this really meaningful and powerful moment transpires in that room. Jay then grabs a pitcher, this one was filled with water this time, and he washes Ryan Archidiakono's feet, and then Arch does the same thing with the person next to him. And Jay says, so it went from one player to the next onto the coaching and administrative staff. The room was silent the entire time. As each player passed the pitcher to the next, it felt to me like we were growing incrementally stronger with each pouring. The message that Father Rob had delivered, that we should all serve one another, struck a chord. So I hope that gave you some kind of flavor of how involved these team chaplains are at Villanova. I thought it was a super cool part of this book, a super cool part of their program. Like I said, there should probably be a book unto itself about these guys. I hope you enjoyed this bonus episode on Jay Wright. There's so much good content in here about how Jay Wright gets established in the coaching profession and how he does that with a great attitude and demonstrating himself as a great teammate, and how that all becomes self-fulfilling and creates some really great opportunities for him in his coaching career. And so to that end, it may be a great one to share with someone you're developing on your staff. There's a lot to learn in Jay's story about that great attitude of showing character and of being a great teammate, and how that will open doors for you and create opportunities for you. Again, the book I used as the source text for this is Attitude: Developing a Winning Mindset on and Off the Court by Jay Wright, Mark D'Agostino, and Michael Sheridan. It's a great one. I'll leave a link to it in the show notes. By the time this episode is released, March Madness should have almost concluded, and the beautiful ritual of spring training baseball is already underway in Arizona and Florida. It's a great time of year. And to that end, I'm going to switch gears a bit into baseball mode, at least for a couple episodes. I'll be releasing an episode on Joe Madden and Earl Weaver coming up, so look for those. Thanks as always for listening.